Hi everybody, a happy 2015 and welcome back to Civil War Monitors Behind the Lines. I am your host David Thompson. Today it's my privilege to be joined by Don Doyle, who is the McCausland Professor of History at the University of South Carolina and the recent author of The Cause of All Nations, an international history of the American Civil War, which is now out with Basic Books. So Dr. Doyle, thank you so much for joining us today.
Oh, thank you, David. I'm glad to be here.
Now, for our viewers who get the privilege, honestly, to pick up this book, this is not your typical examination, really, of international relations during the war, formal diplomacy, so to speak. You've taken a bit of a different angle at this. So why don't you offer us a bit of a broad overview of what this book really is about?
Well, I felt that the story of the diplomatic history has been told and told very well, most recently by Howard Jones, who has he is the leading historian now of the diplomatic history, but a number of others have done this, Brian Jenkins and several others. More recently, Amanda Foreman did a big study of Anglo-American relations. I wanted to do two things. One was I was interested in broadening the framework geographically. I think that Britain was very important, but so was France and Spain and even Italy and Russia and the other minor players, but especially Latin America. I wanted to tell the story about Mexico and Santo Domingo and the invasion by Spain of those countries and of France into Mexico. So I wanted to broaden the frame, but also shift the focus, not to ignore the formal diplomacy and the geopolitics of nation states and empires, but to look at the public forum, the public mind, and the debate overseas that foreigners joined in this, what they call the American question.
Now, you start really at the beginning of this book with Giuseppe Garibaldi. And it's an individual, he pops up several times over the course of the work. But I wondered, for those of us, myself included before I picked this book up, who didn't necessarily have a great understanding of Garibaldi and his connection to the Civil War, if you could flesh that out a bit for our viewers of how exactly he ties into this Civil War.
Yeah, the first chapter I called Garibaldi's Question. And, of course, my first job was to explain to contemporary readers what everyone in the 19th century knew, and that was that Giuseppe Garibaldi was a global hero, a kind of, Lucy Bryall says that he was the first real global hero. And he represented, of course, Italian nationalism, but much more than that, a kind of broad international struggle for what he would call universal emancipation, not just of African slaves, but of people everywhere. He was a hero. He was the hero of two worlds. He had fought in Latin America, in Uruguay, in Brazil before that, and had been identified with this kind of broader international risorgimento, this resurgence of ideals that had been fought for and failed in revolutionary movements going back to the French Revolution in Europe. And so the story begins with this approach that the United States made, with Lincoln's approval and knowledge, to Giuseppe Garibaldi to invite him to command an army in the struggle against the rebellion in the South. And it comes to a boil in the summer of 1861, right at the beginning of the war. And I begin with the story of Henry Sanford, the kind of ambassador to Europe at large and head of Secret Service operations, as they called them then, who's on his way to this tiny island of the Mediterranean to make this formal invitation to Garibaldi.
And Sanford is going to pop up again, and I think the diplomats, well, you're looking at public diplomacy, and you make that very clear in your introduction. Certainly, the diplomats do play a role in this work on both sides, right, for the Union and the Confederacy from the outset. And I wondered if you could explain a little bit, this is really, a story, I suppose, of two halves. I know there's a lot of permutations involved in that, but with the Emancipation Proclamation and the shift of war aims for the Union, changing policy. But prior to the Emancipation Proclamation, how did both the Union and the Confederacy really, I guess, attempt to paint their adversaries abroad?
Yeah, this is, my focus is much more on this, what we now call public diplomacy. That word, that phrase was coined later in World War I, and now is a fairly common expression. We use it to describe sometimes secret and subtle efforts to mold the public mind. I argue that this war witnessed the first really major state-sponsored, deliberate programs of public diplomacy on both sides, and that both of them were responding to this new situation where there were mass circulation journals and at least a widely expanded literate public. And if people couldn't read, things were read to them. And one of the things that I became aware of was what the Union and Confederate agents were aware of, was that there was a public mind and that it could be addressed mainly through the press, but also through speeches and through other activities. So the Union at the beginning of the war is trying to make their case for war based on national self-preservation. It's kind of a conservative argument that we are a nation and this is a rebellion and a domestic insurrection. It's a legal argument partly. It means that no foreign powers can come into this without committing an act of war against the United States. But it's also an argument that says, look, we're not here to abolish slavery. Our purpose is to put down this rebellion. This is a treasonous rebellion led by a selfish group of fanatics. And we are doing what any nation, any empire would do, and that is to preserve our national existence. This was very appealing to those European empires that had their own colonies and rebels abroad in Ireland, in Africa, in other parts of the world. The Confederacy was intent on making its case also in a kind of legalistic way. That is that they argued secession, and that word was chosen very carefully, was a legal and peaceful process, even constitutional. They argued that this was a voluntary compact and that they were leaving because the conditions under which they had joined this compact, this union, had been violated. Of course, all of those violations had to do with slavery for the most part, but the Confederate diplomacy was very focused on not ignoring slavery, but simply not engaging that issue, and in focusing instead on economic issues, the tariff. But their appeal in the end was, ironically, it was a liberal appeal. We are a nation, we are a people, we want to govern ourselves. We are like liberal nationalists in Hungary and elsewhere that Americans admired, trying to establish these basic principles of self-government. So there's an ironic kind of positioning here that puts the Union in a position of conquest. The South was saying they're tyrants and they're trying to dominate us, and places the South in this, making this kind of liberal appeal to self-government and to the right to self-government. That had to change if the Union was going to win. And that goes back to Garibaldi's question, what are you fighting for? If you're not fighting for slavery, if this is just another civil war, another quarrel over territory and sovereignty, then the world won't care about it. And so that kind of sets up the plot of the book, which is to find the answer to Garibaldi's question for the Union side. And that's where I now turn to what foreigners had to say back to the Union and to the Confederacy. This is what we think your war is about, or ought to be about. And there too, it's not just the liberals saying this ought to be a war against slavery and for emancipation. It was actually conservatives in Britain and elsewhere who first took up the argument that here is a proof positive that the experiment in self-government, the democratic experiment or the Republican experiment, they used the words almost interchangeably, had failed. That people can't govern themselves. That you have to have a dynasty, a king, a monarch, and an established church. And that this experiment in self-rule was doomed always to fall into either anarchy or despotism. And here you have it. And so with that idea, the conservatives, of course, were in Britain were trying to stave off democratic reforms in Britain. And the French conservatives were saying, see, this is what happens. It's the same thing that happened to us after the revolution of 1789. And so it was conservatives that kind of begin this paradigm of the war as a trial of democracy. And at first you see a lot of liberals and the unionists saying, oh no, it's not that. And then they learn to embrace it. They learn to make that the argument.
Now, I wondered if you could build off of this just a little bit more, and if you, in the sense of how do both Union and Confederacy, the formal governments, realize that the fact of the matter is, native Europeans are making the case better than their own agents. How do they reconcile that? Do they reach out to these individuals to be the formal mouthpiece? Is money being exchanged? Because they must have realized, and well, they do, and you lay it out quite clearly in the book that these individuals, these native speakers, they're making the case far better than any of their agents have up to this point in the war. So, what do they do once that realization is made?
Well, that's interesting. This is the lesson of public diplomacy and what we now call soft power, that it's not just a matter of paying for a bigger megaphone and shouting louder propaganda at foreign nations. It's a matter of listening, too. And I think that one of the things that Seward told his diplomats when he sent them overseas is that your job there will be to report on the public sentiment through the press, but through all avenues of information. And so you have in the dispatches sent back to Washington a good deal of very interesting commentary on what the public mood is. And it's based on conversations, but also on readings of the press. But they were instructed by Seward to tell him to be the eyes and ears of the Union. And of course, the Confederacy also sent agents over with the idea that they were to listen and to report on this. One of the most poignant examples of this came with Karl Schurz, who was, of course, a former radical revolutionary, a German 48er, who was, against Seward's advice, appointed as the minister to Spain, a very conservative Catholic country, of course. And Schurz wrote in September of 1861 this long, passionate dispatch to Seward that said, look, the governments of Europe are against us. They are wishing the worst for this democratic experiment. They want to see us fail. But the people of Europe, the liberal public, see in us the best hope of self-government, of their ideals of liberty and equality. And they want this war to be a war against slavery. And if you make it a war against slavery, it will stop the government. It will make it impossible for the government to endorse a rebellion to preserve, protect, and perpetuate slavery. And, of course, Seward tells Schurz, we're not going down that road. This is not going to be a revolutionary war against slavery. And you just mind your business. And, of course, Schurz resigns and comes back and he talks to Lincoln. This meeting takes place in January of 1861. And I made a lot of this meeting because Schurz is not certain whether or not Seward is speaking for him. He's not certain about Lincoln's position on slavery. And they have a very frank conversation in Lincoln's office. And Shores comes away from that realizing that Lincoln is listening, that he's read all his dispatches, and that he knows what's going on. And Lincoln says, I think you may be right. You probably are right, that no country could make war against the Union or could intervene in the war once it became a question of slavery or emancipation. But he said, we're not ready for that yet. We're not ready. The European public might be ready for that, but our public is not. And he actually encouraged Shores to criticize his position on slavery. And Shores came out of that realizing he wants this criticism that is coming from Sumner and from others. So that was a very important meeting, and I think a good example of the way that the Union was listening and learning about the new game of public diplomacy and soft power.
Now, as you point out, Lincoln at that point is not ready to fully come out in support of emancipation and a shift, real true shift in war aims, away from a war of union, so to speak, to a war of emancipation. But that ultimately does come. By the fall of '62, it's formalized. The Emancipation Proclamation goes into effect Jan 1, 1863. How, I guess, what is the European reaction to this formal declaration now on the part of the government, and how do Union and Confederate agents react overseas?
Yes, of course, Lincoln comes to this decision, we think, in June or July of that summer, that long, painful summer when McClellan's Peninsular Campaign fails. And as he later said, we were at the end of our rope. Now, the Emancipation Proclamation has been written about and studied from every angle. It's really important to understand it as foreign policy. And that's what I tried to do. I realized that first disagreement, the previous September, between Shores and Seward, that's kind of an ongoing debate within the Lincoln administration. And Seward continues to say that emancipation will backfire on us. Emancipation will actually bring in European intervention. Emancipation will frighten the Europeans and the business interests there in particular to think that the whole cotton economy is going to be embroiled in some kind of racial holocaust. And he urged Lincoln to postpone and to let the war itself resolve the question of slavery. And others, like Shores and many foreign voices too, really believed that unless they made this a war against slavery, that they were going to lose the whole game. Not the military struggle, but the larger struggle over public sympathy for the Union in Europe in particular. And so Lincoln decides, and I think listening to both Seward and Shores, postponing the decision. When he finally decides on it in September, after Antietam, one of the first things Lincoln does is to tell Seward, send this Emancipation Proclamation to every legation and consulate around the world for the United States. So it was, in his mind, very definitely a foreign policy measure, as well as domestic policy. Well, Seward was right. At least the press and a lot of the government officials saw the Emancipation Proclamation as a radical new phase in the war, a desperate effort by the Union to incite servile insurrection. And they used all kinds of racialist attacks against Lincoln and the Union to discredit the Emancipation Proclamation in the press. Even liberal journals in Britain were denouncing the Emancipation Proclamation. Now, in France, I found that they welcomed it, that they saw, that is, the liberal press in France saw this as the necessary moral solution to the Union's problem in trying to win public support in France and across Europe. It played out over that 100 days between the initial announcement and the final proclamation in January. In the meantime, the European forces, the European great powers, Britain and France, actually had launched a plan to intervene in the war. And that was taking place as Lincoln was deciding on the Emancipation Proclamation in September and October. And they were going forward. John Russell, the Foreign Secretary in Britain, when he caught wind of the Emancipation Proclamation, said, this is the time to move. They are now resorting to this drastic effort to unleash the fury of the slaves of the South. And so Seward was right in that sense. But it all fell apart in the end. And here's where Garibaldi comes on stage again. This, what appears to be a kind of extraneous rebellion or march on Rome in the south of Italy, actually upsets that apple cart in Europe. It causes a crisis, not in the Italian government, but also not only in the Italian government, but also in the French government. And Napoleon has to dismiss his Foreign Secretary, Juvenal, and it creates a little crisis. The alliance falls apart, or at least the plan to intervene falls apart or postponed. There are huge riots in Hyde Park and across Europe in favor of Garibaldi. And it's clear, at the same time, Garibaldi writes a letter to the English nation. And this is something that I don't think American historians have been familiar with. But this was the first really full-throated endorsement by Garibaldi and by the liberal European public of the Union cause. And Garibaldi says to the British people, to the English nation, join your daughters, the Americans, who are now struggling for human emancipation against these traitors in flesh. Well, what's interesting is that the letter was written on September 28th, long before Garibaldi could have known about the Emancipation Proclamation, because the news would not arrive until early October. But in effect, Garibaldi was kind of proclaiming emancipation before Lincoln did. And I think he had reason to know that this was in the works, because he was in correspondence with the U.S. ambassador in Italy, George Perkins Marsh. To circle back to your question, the public begins to, the press is still denouncing the Emancipation Proclamation, but public meetings begin to take place in Britain. Public meetings of this sort were banned in France and elsewhere. But in Britain, hundreds of public meetings begin to take place in January, February, and March. Petitions. And here the emancipation organizations in Britain begin to kind of create news and go around the press. They have a big meeting, they publish resolutions, and they're kind of generating their own news and demonstrating to the British public, to the British government, and to the international world that at least in Britain, where people are free to express themselves, that the popular support for Lincoln, the Emancipation Proclamation, and for the Union is overwhelming. And I think somewhere in that spring of 1863, it became nearly impossible for Palmerston and for the British government to really seriously consider an intervention in the government. Not that they didn't, but I think it would have been so politically dangerous by this time that that now the Emancipation Proclamation had really shifted the game against the Confederacy.
Now, as hopes for the Confederacy in terms of recognition on the part of Britain fade, there still is, albeit perhaps waning even by 63, hope that France might come to their side. And obviously Napoleon III is the figurehead of France here, and he's the most important character at this time. So how does Napoleon III figure into this? Because it's obviously a very complicated relationship once you factor in Mexico.
Yeah. The Confederates were beginning to lose hope and getting really impatient with Britain They recognized that Britain had anti-slavery sentiment, and the populist Britain really saw itself as the international leader of the anti-slavery movement, and they were very proud of that. Now that the United States was beginning to make this an abolition war, that made their position difficult. They did all they could to inflame this indignation against servile insurrection and Lincoln's barbarous act, but it was beginning to play against them. In France, the Confederates saw a potential strong ally. They offered, in that same summer of 1862, a major economic inducement to the French, what is called a cotton bribe. Essentially, it offered the equivalent of $12 million to the French if they would come in and pick up cotton and drastically reduce prices. And, of course, Napoleon III asked John Slidell, the Confederate envoy, how are we to get this cotton? And Slidell said, you'll have to come over and get it and use your navy, and you'll be able to beat the Union, and we'll make common cause against our enemy, the United States. And Slidell and others begin to develop this idea that the South is really Latin, that Louisiana is French, and that the Huguenots in South Carolina have a deep tradition of sympathy and affection for the French, and that they are perfectly content with the idea of France coming into Mexico and setting up a monarchy. We don't have a Monroe Doctrine, Slidell told Napoleon III. And so it really looked like Napoleon III saw in the Confederacy a perfect ally. His purpose in coming into Mexico was not just to install an orderly, monarchic Catholic government and to create a kind of Latin Catholic empire in Latin America, not just Mexico, by the way, but all of Latin America, according to his grand design. But he wanted also the Confederacy to succeed and create a buffer state between Mexico and the United States. Their idea was not just to separate the Confederacy, but really to contain the United States, to fragment it, to dismember it. Napoleon would talk about taking back the Mexican cession of 1848 and reclaiming California for the Empire of Mexico. So there was a new game there, and my chapter on the Latin strategy deals with this effort to bring in France and also to ally the Vatican with the Confederate cause.
Finally, Dr. Doyle, I'll let you go with this question. And really, obviously, the international dimension of the war, as you point out, particularly from a public diplomacy angle, really hasn't been told. And I wonder now, looking back on certainly years of research and writing, what value do you see in looking at the international dimension of this war on a more complicated scale than just purely the diplomatic portion of it? I guess that's the first part of the question. The second part is, what can it, if by studying, having American historians and scholars write about international approaches to American topics, what value does that provide to a deeper, more nuanced understanding of 19th or 20th century American history?
That's a really good question. I think the main takeaway that I had as I waded into this new sea of material on foreign opinion and diplomacy was that the American Civil War was not just our war. It really mattered to people overseas, in Latin America and in Europe. And they saw this as a kind of a proxy war, a contest in which their interests, their ideals were also at stake. Everything was up for grabs. And I think that it really mattered to both sides, the Union and the Confederacy, that it mattered to people. In other words, the public involvement, their engagement in this war would matter to the diplomacy that unfolded. And the most important event in the Civil War was what did not happen. That is, the recognition of the Confederacy. if Britain or France had recognized, or Spain had recognized the Confederacy, it would have turned the tide of war. I think it would have been impossible for the Union to sustain a multinational war against the likes of Britain, France, and or Spain in alone or in combination. And so it mattered to the world at the time, and it mattered to diplomacy that the public was engaged. But also in the long view of things, I think that this war really made a difference. You know, when Lincoln talked about America as the last best hope of Earth, he wasn't bragging. The idea of government by the people was really on the ropes. Across Latin America, it was besieged by military despots and pronunciamientos, and now the invasion by European powers, sweeping aside the Monroe Doctrine and coming in to take over Mexico, Santo Domingo, strengthening their hold on Cuba. All of this made a big difference. So after 1865, you see the results. Those empires that were kind of like vultures coming in as the secession crisis developed, they retreated. In Mexico, in early 1866, Napoleon III announces that the civilizing mission in France is over and that the troops are going to withdraw. And Juarez, with help from the United States, by the way, begins to score victories against Maximilian. And of course, Maximilian comes to his sad end before a firing squad in June 1867. In Cuba, there's great unrest. The slaves, all during the Civil War, would chant this song, Avanza Lincoln, Avanza, tu eres nuestra esperanza, you are our hope. And so they seemed to understand that this war would have an impact on them. And it did. A Republican revolution took place beginning in 1868, and it was joined to a promise of emancipation. Now, it did not end in the emancipation of Cuba, but it did end in the destruction of slavery in Cuba. They passed a law giving freedom. Spain passed a law in response to this revolution to end slavery by a free womb law. Brazil followed suit. One of the Brazilian senators said, "We don't need a civil war to end slavery here. The world laughing at us was enough." And so in 1871, they passed a free womb law too. But look at Russia too, the sale of Alaska, another empire retreat. And in what we now call Canada, Canada was really created during the Civil War by Britain to set up what is essentially an autonomous, self-governing nation. And Britain doesn't withdraw from Canada, but they really set it up as a self-governing entity and shift their priorities to Asia and elsewhere. So it made a huge difference to the survival of democracy and the end of slavery. And I think that our Civil War really mattered to the world in a way that I don't think we had appreciated before.
Well, Dr. Doyle, I wanted to thank you again for taking some time to come on and speak with us. Again, everyone, the book is The Cause of All Nations, An International History of the American Civil War, now out with Basic Books. It reads very well, I must say. It's a relatively quick read for those out there who fear, at times that, there's not enough time in the day to read. It's a great narrative to go through, and there are some fascinating characters involved. But I think it really highlights the truly international scope of this conflict. And here we are 150 years from Appomattox now coming up in April. And the fact was that this was not a war confined solely to these borders, but it resonated throughout the world and had far deeper implications, which you emphasize here, Dr. Doyle. So again, thank you so much for coming on, and perhaps we can have you on again in the future.
Thanks so much, David. I've really enjoyed it.